Hey everyone, in previous lecture I discussed participation constraint, complex attribute, role and non-binary relationship. How can we represent all these in ER diagram? Today I will discuss weak entity set. The entity set for which we cannot form the primary key called as weak entity set. So the entity set which doesn't have primary key called as weak entity set. What is primary key? That uniquely identify the entity in the entity set called as primary key. We can say an entity set that doesn't have sufficient attribute to form a primary key termed as weak entity set. And what is strong entity set? The entity set which have primary key. Okay, called as strong entity set. It's just opposite of weak entity set. Weak entity set doesn't have primary key, whereas strong entity set have the primary key. And weak entity set doesn't have any meaning. To make it meaningful, it should have some owner identity set. For any pet, how can identify it? So by their owner, right? Like the same way, for each weak entity set, there is a identifying or owner entity set. And weak entity set must be associated with its owner entity set. So how it will associate? By a relationship. And I already discussed before, the relationship for weak entity set will be double diamond. Here you can see this relation is just a single diamond. For weak entity set, it will be double diamond, right? The weak entity set is dependent on the owner entity set, okay? And the owner entity set own the weak entity set. For any pet, we can say the pet have some owner. So it can be identified by the owner. And that identifying entity set own the weak entity set. And that relationship called as identifying relationship. So how that weak entity set relate to the strong entity set? The relationship associated the weak entity set with the strong entity set or identifying entity set called as identifying relationship. The identifying relationship is many to one from weak entity to strong entity, and the participation is total. For many to one, in one side there will be the arrow mark, and for total there will be double line. And that relationship cannot have descriptive attribute. Generally, relationship can have some descriptive attribute, but in case of weak entity, that identifying relationship that relate weak entity to its owner entity set should not have the descriptive attribute. Rather than adding the descriptive attribute with the relationship, we can add with the weak entity set. So in our example, section is the weak entity and course is the owner entity set. So section is related with course by section course relationship. So section course is the identifying relationship, section is the weak entity and course is the owner entity. And the attributes of weak entity called as discriminator. So in our example, for section ID, year and semester called as discriminator. And the discriminator of weak entity set called as partial key of the entity set. In case of strong entity, there can be primary key, but in case of weak entity, all attributes are called as partial key. Then how will identify weak entity set? It doesn't have primary key. It is dependent on its owner entity set. We can form the primary key of weak entity set by combining with its owner primary key. Means it's all partial key plus owner primary key. So that way we can form primary key of weak entity set. So primary key of identifying entity set plus all the discriminator of the weak entity set. Let's see the ER diagram for this. So we have two entity set, section, course. Section is the weak entity set and course is the owner entity set, or you can say identifying entity set. Section course, this is the identifying relationship. It's a double diamond that indicate that it is related with a weak entity set. And here this is a total participation. From weak entity set to the identifying relationship is a total participation, and the relationship is many to one from section to course. One side there is arrow mark. And here what will be primary key of section? Section ID, semester, year and course ID. So primary key of weak entity set we can form with the primary key of owner entity set and all the discriminator. So course ID plus section ID, semester, year, that is the primary key for section. And here course ID is the primary key of course. Here both entity set we can represent by the rectangle, section and course. Then how can identify that this is a weak entity set and this is the owner entity set? In owner entity set there is primary key, but in the weak entity set there are no primary key. So there are mainly two differences. The discriminator of weak entity set is underlined as a dash rather than solid line. So these are the partial key. These are underlined as dashed, right? And second one, the identifying relationship is a double diamond. As this is a double diamond, so we can say this is connected with a weak entity set. And here there are double lines, so total participation. Relationship from section to course is a many to one relationship. As this is a total participation means each section should be related with a course, okay? And here is single arrow, here is one, right? This is a many to one relationship. So that means every section is related with one course, right? So there can be many sections. Okay, this is section 1, section 2, section 3. Each section is related with one course, right? Suppose in case of computer science department, there can be AI section, networking section, database section, there can be programming section. So there can be different section and every section is related with the course. In today's lecture, I discussed what is weak entity set, how can represent weak entity set in the ER diagram. In next lecture, I will discuss a complete ER diagram of a university. If this lecture is helpful for you, please like, share and subscribe. Thank you. Bye-bye.